Oh, got sound. It totally changes how we approach structuring web applications. And one of the things that I like to talk about when it comes to React is a little bit of philosophy behind what we do with the components. Because when you're dealing with, say, straight, DOM manipulation, jQuery, stuff like that, you are stuck with the 137, whatever it is, HTML tags that are built in. And you have to use things like data attributes and hovers and click binding and all those other kinds of add-on bits to get the behavior and the performance out of some invisible box that you've put on a page that you want. And React kind of changes that. And so the example that I like to give is the example of an anchor tag. Yeah, stands for anchor. It anchors two documents together. Because a link tag does something different. Well, I mean, we're not going to rule that out yet, but too soon. Okay. So if we look at the anchor tag, we know what this is. We know that this is giving context to the text that we've wrapped it around. We know that there is a predefined behavior that's going to happen. In fact, a couple of predefined behaviors. Specifically, if we hover over the lighthouse, we get the hand as a cursor. Also, if we hover long enough, we get the tooltip that will say Lighthouse Labs. That's what the title attribute gives us. So that attribute modifies the behavior of this element. And we know that if we click on it, the browser is going to grab the URL that is in the href attribute, and it's going to change the window.location to be that new location. So this is a component of a web page. And we can use this, and we've been taught how to use this, and we know what an anchor tag does, and we don't even think twice about pulling this out of our toolkit. But what if I wanted to write an anchor component in React? I could just write anchor, but I could still give it an href attribute, and that would just be a prop getting passed in. I could still give it the title prop. We could still do that. Lighthouse would now be the one of the children of the React component that we would be able to render using props.children. So I could define this and go into this component. I could add CSS to this component so that by default the children are done with blue text and underlined, and that I can change the state of this component so that if this link is being clicked on, that's now purple. I can add the click handler to the entire element so that if it's clicked on, I change window.location. I can use CSS and I can style a little tooltip component. And if it's hovered over, I could set a timer for like a second and a half. And when that timer expires, the function would run. How about now? Can you hear me now? Okay. I'll keep an eye on this. It may be a battery issue. Morning. Do we have other batteries out here? Yeah, please. Oh, yeah, we've got some. Okay, Calgary, I'm going to swap batteries real quick. Okay, should be good now. Thanks for the heads up, Dave. Okay. So yeah, there's a big push to get us to the point that web components are an actual thing, but React gives us a scripted way to do it for now. And React as kind of like a paradigm exists separately from a lot of the other front-end JavaScript frameworks that you're going to find. You'll hear about Angular and Ember and Vue and Aurelia and a few others. Each one of them has their own opinion as to what is the right structure and interface and everything for building a front end in a single page app. React's happens to match, where we're going with this particular spec, and it's got a ton of, obviously a ton of energy behind it because of Facebook. So with that in mind, what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk through the React lifecycle, like basically the lifecycle of a component, because my personal opinion is if you understand when these methods run and what it is they're touching when they're running, you've got a way better opportunity to build a proper set of components for an application and understand why stuff happens when it happens. Because otherwise, people have a tendency to, kind of just poke at React and, hope it does what they want it to do. But there's not actually a lot of methods that we have to know. And if you actually know and understand and can manage the lifecycle methods, you're in a much better place. So the whole point of this image is to describe the lifecycle. And the whole thing is to go from this white circle here in the upper left to the black circle here in the middle. The white circle in the upper left is the definition of a component. That is a component that you have written the code for, that has been loaded into the app, but has not actually been rendered to the page yet. The black component, or black dot, is a component that has been rendered to the page. So it actually exists in the DOM. So let's talk about this term right up here, React DOM.render. And the reason I want to talk about that is because there's right now, technically three main flavors of React. React Universal, React DOM, and React Native. And you'll hear those terms a lot, and you can read about 400 million blog posts on all of them. But React Universal is the ability to define behavior and appearance of components using the React syntax. Being able to extend the base component and have access to these methods. That's React Universal. Once you have defined a layout and defined functionality and what your application is by this relationship of components, then your app is either going to be rendered into a web property using React DOM, or it's going to be rendered into a native application for mobile using React Native. So there isn't a difference, substantially in between those three. React Universal is just our ability to build components. Then React DOM takes those components, renders them in a web property. React Native takes those components, renders them on mobile. Which the nice part about that is it means that once you know React Universal as a general technology, being able to build something that can function on multiple different media now is now a flexibility you have. There are some small differences and variances, even between like iOS and Android when it comes to native, and we still run into a few small browser differences here and there, though less than we used to. And again, Safari. But when we have this definition of a component, React DOM.render is what is actually taking that component definition and bringing it into a web DOM. That's its job. Whereas React Native would take that component and make it be part of a UI of a native platform. So when we're going to render a component in React, there's a couple things that are going to happen to start off with. The component is going to check to see if it has default props. That's one of the very first things it's going to do. Because props come from outside the component and are passed in to the component, and typically once they are passed into the component, they don't change. And the reason they don't change once they get passed in is because that component that they're passed into is not responsible for managing that data. It's like if I ask you to hold my laptop, I'm not asking you to reformat it. I'm just asking you to hold it. And then, if I suddenly get a new laptop and you are my designated laptop holder, which I'm sure is a prestigious job somewhere, and I hand you the new laptop, you're still not going to reformat it. You're just going to do what you were given the data to do. So very similar with props. Props are going to get passed in from outside, typically from the parent component, and we have the ability with a React component to set default props so that if the parent doesn't give us data that we need, then we can set a default on it and have at least a default set of data for our component to work with. Now, not all components need props, but if they do, we can make sure that our component isn't going to break if it doesn't get the data it needs. So we can set defaults. Next stage we're going to go to is to get the initial state. So this is where, for example, in your constructor, you would do this.state equals bang, object. And that's where we are now building the state that is most likely going to change over the course of using our component. And state is entirely internal. And that state is, very much like when you first wake up in the morning, what is your initial state? And then over the course of the day, that will change based on things like coffee and naps and code and, ups and downs of real life and, stepping in a puddle and all those things that may affect your state. But what's the initial one? When you first wake up, what is that initial state? So it allows us to set up where our component is going to be when it first gets rendered. Now, the next function that's on here is technically one that's in the React lifecycle, but it's not one that you as a developer would interact with. And its component will mount. And this one exists, and unfortunately there's a lot of code on Stack Overflow and things like that leverage this method because for the longest time, as we were building best practices around React, it wasn't clear which one of this or component did mount was going to be the best way to do things. The React developers have even gone so far as to say that they may take away component will mount as being an exposed method, as a lifecycle method for you to use. Because one of the interesting things with component will mount is basically saying, yes, this component is going to be added to the DOM. We know this is going to happen. And so people were putting things like AJAX calls in here to get, to go fetch some data from an API or something like that. Let's say this was a user's profile component. So you'd go and fetch RESTfully the data from the API to get the user data. The problem is you now have what we call a race condition. You don't know if the component is going to get added to the DOM before you have the data. So you could potentially get, there's a lovely acronym that we use a lot, which is this. Anybody know what this is? Flash of unstyled content. So you might get content that, like you might get a component that shows up that doesn't have any data, and then suddenly, data appears and stuff moves around. So yeah, there's a couple different ways that could manifest. And so because of the asynchronous nature of how people were using it, and because of the kind of inherent unpredictability, there's not a specific time point in the future that you can say, yes, 100% this component is going to be rendered at that time. Using component will mount is now considered not a best practice. So if you see it on Stack Overflow, take it with a grain of salt. Then there's render. So component will mount, and render is what actually takes the component and turns it into DOM elements. And render runs all of that code, and if there are subcomponents inside of your render, it's going to go and trigger this same process for those components so that they have to go through their render cycle and return back to here, and then these will render down. And we've seen how fast React works now. So to know that this whole cascade of rendering and lifecycle methods happens, and we don't even see like a moment's twitch in the UI, gives you an appreciation for just how fast React runs. Once it has rendered, then we have component did mount. And this is where I will draw your attention to this dotted line right here, where it says that this is a method that can use this .setState. So component did mount means, and I'm going to use this term loosely, and if you quote me on this later, I reserve the right to squirt you with a water gun. But when we were using jQuery, we wrapped everything in document ready so that when the DOM was actually there, then we would start running our code. Component did mount is like that, but for an individual component. It says that the code, this is the place you would put the code that is going to interact with the parts of your component, because that component now actually exists. So this is also where you would put that Ajax code, and because of the way the render cycle works, you don't get that flash of unstyled content anymore. So the can use this .setState means that component did mount is the first place, because we're going to ignore will mount. It's the first place in this entire chain before it's just sitting there on the page, where if we need to change the state, we can. This .setState is the only way that we change the state. We can set the state once using this .state in the constructor. That's the get initial state. But component did mount is the first place in the life cycle where we have the ability to change the state. Once component did mount is done, we are at the black dot point, which is a great point to be at because that is our component just sitting there waiting to be interacted with. Now, there are a couple of things which can trigger this component to be active. One is, of course, we could actually do something like a click or a hover or anything that we have bound an event listener to do, and that's just the JavaScript portion of using React. But there are three very specific React things that can happen which will trigger a change in the component. The first of them is a setProps event. Now, setProps is not a method that you would use. But setProps internally in React is the method that gets used if the parent now passes new props down to the component. So the data somehow changes at the parent level so that its render method gets triggered, and its render method is now passing new props to this component. setProps is going to be run, and that's going to bring us to component will receive props. And the next props we're going to get is an object, key value pair. So component will receive props is a method, is a lifecycle method, where the component knows that it's about to receive new props. That has been triggered by the parent component, and we can see what the next props are going to be. That means, if necessary, this is a place where we can trigger this.setState. Component will receive props moves us to should component update. Now, if you read this, and if you're actually just thinking in English, the name of this method is should component update. What do you suspect it should return? Not an updated component. True or false? Should the component update? That's literally what we're asking. We want yes or no, 1, 0, true or false, Boolean logic. So should component update, if it returns false, we just go back to the black dot. We don't do anything, because we've said this component should not update. Whereas if it's true, should component update brings us to component will update, which brings us back to render, which brings us to component did update, and back to the black dot. The second thing that can trigger this is calling setState. So anytime we do this.setState, it brings us to run should component update, which if it's true, component will update, render, component did update, back to the black dot. So every time we run this.setState, potentially we are re-rendering our component. And that can be dangerous, and let me tell you how. So let's say that you define a component did update method for your component. So that after the render happens, like once it's been on the page, after the render happens, you run a method, and in component did update, you call this.setState. Well, you calling this.setState sends us to should component update, which if it is true, brings us to component will update and render and component did update. Where you have a this.setState defined, which brings us up to should component update, which if it returns true, takes us to component will update to render to component did update. Where you have a this.set, you see the loop here. So this is why it's important to know this is the order that these methods run in and what these trigger, because it keeps you from writing infinite render loops. The third one that can happen is what's called a force update. And I don't even like that they reference this in this image, because once you know that force update exists, you suddenly think it's the solution to all of your problems. Well, this didn't do what I wanted, so I guess I have to run a force update. No. There is almost no justifiable, reasonable excuse for running force update. If you find yourself in a React situation where you feel that it's finally the right time to run force update, go back and rethink it. I can almost guarantee you will never be in the situation where that is necessary. Force update is what React does when it is comparing what's called the shadow DOM with the real DOM and deciding that there's a difference between the two. They've gotten out of sync and need to be updated. So the shadow DOM is the virtual version of the DOM that is held in memory, and that's where React actually does all of its data updates. Every change that happens to a DOM element, React does it to the shadow DOM first. And then what it does is it computes the difference between the shadow DOM and the real DOM and changes the real DOM to reflect that. And it does that with a difference algorithm that is so fast that puts it way ahead of the other frameworks. But force update is basically it's React's way of saying, make this thing look like that thing now, do it because I said so. Is it render that compares those two? Render is part of the process. There are multiple points along the way. Should component update is one of the other ones. Component will update and component did update are callbacks when React confirms that yes, an update should happen and that yes, it has made what it thinks is the required data change. There's actually multiple points where React compares the two to make sure that what's in the real DOM matches what it thinks should be in the shadow DOM. You don't ever have to touch that process. You shouldn't ever touch that process. You know, it's like when you see a printing press, like there's no point when you need to stick your hand into the gears of the machine while it's running and go, oh yeah, I'll fix it, as opposed to just, you know, turning it off. So force update exists. Just, you know, put the plastic cover over it and say do not touch. Because yes, it exists, but really it's designed for React to use internally when it needs to force that update to happen. But force update brings us directly to component will update, and it bypasses should component update. Now, all of these blue boxes here are all boxes that you can write in your component. Almost always you're going to have a render, because otherwise you don't really have a component. But just because these blue boxes exist as lifecycle methods doesn't mean you have to put one of these methods in every single component. You're going to put the ones in that you need. By default, the component definition in React has all of these and they all run. You only need to put the ones in to your component because you're extending that are necessary for your component to function. So if you don't need a component did mount, don't add one. Know that it exists, know that it runs, but if you don't need custom behavior at that point, there's no need for you to write one. Yep. Yes. So this render here is different than React DOM.render. React DOM.render is what starts the rendering. Basically, that's the catalyst that renders the initial app object. And then once app has been rendered into the page, its render cycle triggers all of the other renders internally in the components. Make sense? Cool. Yeah, this is like the pilot light of the application, basically. Yeah. Now, the other thing that's worth noting is that we can go from the black dot to the white dot, and that's called unmounting. And it's the exact opposite process of component did mount is component will unmount. And times when you would want to have a component will unmount and have it run is, let's say, for example, we'll go back to the user profile card, and you got an icon on there to delete that user. And you might even pop up a confirmation. Are you sure you want to nuke Bob? Yes. And when you do that, that component, that card needs to be removed from the DOM. And you might want to then take that opportunity to send the AJAX request to delete that resource on the server side. It has to be component will unmount, because once the component has been removed completely from the DOM, it's not actively running any code anymore. It can't be component did unmount, because that object, like the actual instance of that React component class, has been deleted from memory, so we can't run code on it. So it's will unmount because it's going to happen before that object gets deleted. But that's one of the typical use cases, is when you need to fire off some kind of cleanup logic, typically AJAX or WebSockets, before that message or before that component is deleted, like deleting a message out of Slack, for example. That you can delete that message and you'll see it disappear from the front end. And when that disappears is when Slack is going to the server and saying, oh, hey, this message now never existed. Sorry. So that's component will unmount. You might use that, once every 6 months or so, perhaps. But it exists. The method that triggers it is actually is from React DOM rather than React Universal. So React DOM.unmount component at node. So it's actually going to look up the DOM node and go, oh, hey, there is a component here, unmount it, and that triggers component will unmount. Any questions about these lovely blue boxes? Yeah, Ben. Yep. Do you still have that information in your database? Potentially, depending on what triggered that process. You could have deleted it some other way. You could, I mean, that's entirely business logic at that point. Whether or not you have the data, whether the data still exists in the database at this point, the standard workflow would say yes, you probably do. Because any changes that happen here are strictly front-end UI changes. Right. Yeah, before it's been deleted from the browser's memory, you have the opportunity to run further code and then go off and run an Ajax call or clean something up. Cool. Other questions? Awesome. Let's go ahead and pause here. Let your brains chew on this for a bit. And then when you come back, we'll talk a bit more about state and props and things like that. All right, so before the break, we talked about the life cycle and all the methods that are available, and I'll definitely send that image out to you guys so that you have a copy of it. Um, but I want to get in and I want to talk a bit more about state versus props. It's okay, I'll wait. Respect. So, props always come in from outside the component. There is, when you're getting prop data, it's never going to be something that you're going to set manually inside. And props are intended to be read-only. There's no need for you to write to props. It's not a variable that's there for you to store and manipulate the data in. It's just there to store it and let you read from it. The reason you don't want to change props is because the parent is what decides what props get passed in. So if you start changing props and then the parent changes the props, who's in charge at that point? So props are intended to be read-only. Again, you can set default props, but they're still read-only. They're designed to be what we call immutable. You don't change them. So props are decided on by the parent when they get passed down through the parent's render cycle. Whereas state is always and only inside the component. State is mutable, meaning you can change it, but only with this dot set state. Never, ever, ever, never, ever, even if you think it's a good idea, ever write to state directly. Now that we've gone through that image, why? Benji. Bingo. If I had a stack of virtual cookies, I would deliver them to you on a silver platter right now. If you write to state directly, you're not running the this.setState method, therefore you are not triggering the component update cycle. And if you don't trigger the component update cycle, then all of those other methods like component did update, should component update, none of those get a chance to run, and your component is now out of sync with what's in the shadow DOM, and React is in the situation of having to run force update. In fact, 999,999 times out of a million, if you think you need to run force update because something's not updating the way you expect, it's probably because you wrote to state directly at some point. Always use this.setState. And again, because we've learned from here, the only places that we should be doing that, there's only 3. Component did mount, component will receive props, and component did update. The times you're going to write a component will receive props method are like none. So really for you it's 2. Component did mount and component did update. Those are the only points where you should be running this.setState. Render is a bad place to run this.setState. Please don't. Because set state triggers a re-render, but you're in a render and you just triggered a re-render. And yes, it's like over mixing cookie dough at that point. So props always come in from outside. They're immutable. State is always set inside. We set it once in the constructor, and then when we do change it, we change it only with this.setState. Any questions on that? Quick example, yes. I don't think I have a React. Do I? Oh, I do have a React template. Okay, good. So typically we would have something like, one moment. Thank you. Um, so I typically have like, class thing extends component. And so here I would have my constructor. My constructor is going to get props as an argument. And in here is where I would do this dot state equals, and it's going to be an object. It's always going to be an object. And I would have, something, other thing, and stuff. And that's my get initial state in my constructor when I set the state. And in my constructor, when I pass in props, I have to run this before I can run this dot state. Why? What'd you learn last week that super does? Most of it, yeah. Super is actually going to run the constructor method here that we have overridden. So there is a constructor method that's defined in the component class. And it is what populates things like this.props and this.state with an initial value. And so props are created basically when this component gets created by React. Props is turned into an object that is key value pairs. That's passed into the constructor. We pass that up the chain to the components constructor so that this.props gets populated correctly. And this.state gets initialized because it'll actually complain if we try and do this.state before we do super props. It'll tell you that you have to run super first. So that's when you'll see this. And once we have this, like once we've run super props, we have access to this.props whatever. And then down here, I would have a render. And this is where I would return and have, a div. I would do things. Bless you. And then I'd do something like this.state.stuff.map. And whatever the element was, and then that would be some other component, where the data is the element itself. Sure, we'll go with that. Yeah. That's kind of how the render of our component would work, and we'd loop over things. So the props, so this would be one side of it. The other side of it is we would have, some kind of class app extends component, assume all the other stuff at the top is there. And its render is going to call thing. And I'm going to pass into it, idea equals learn React, and project equals chatty. Like my render is going to be, rendering that component, and that data is going to get passed in. And over here, I could actually, have like if this dot props dot project equals chatty then do this. Else, the indentation on this template really sucks. Else alert something else. Like I can build logic around my props anywhere I want once they've been initialized in my constructor with super props. Then I can read from those props any point I want and change the behavior of my component. And I'll go back to the example I gave here where these attributes on the anchor tag are there to specifically change the behavior of that tag, like, of that component of the page. And, let's actually do this. Let's make a new one. And let's actually look at how that anchor would get implemented. So, the props, theoretically we would have some default props that we would define, but let's just think about it for a moment. So we'd run super props. The state of this component, we'd want to say that the status is new because it's a new link. Nobody's clicked on it yet. Well, actually, let's change this. Let's say click count is 0 because nobody's clicked on it. What else would be the state of an anchor tag? Well, that's kind of the click count. Yeah, I mean, CSS is a whole other thing. Like what the string is? We'd probably pass that in as a prop, to be honest. So yeah, we would get that from there. We'll call that, this.props.link text. We'll do it that way. What else is the, when you first put a link on a page, what else is kind of built into that link out of the box? The title, well, we don't have a title by default. In fact, we only get that title, like that toolbar behavior, if we pass a title attribute. Pardon? That's the title attribute, the tooltip. No, that's the link text, yeah. Well, by default, the URL that it's going to go to when you click on it, if you don't specify an href, it doesn't do anything. So that's yeah, the href is going to come in through props. So let's just leave it with this to begin with. And let's look at the render method. So we're going to have a span because it's an inline element. So we'd want to do that. And let's say that we would have, color blue, text decoration, underline as kind of the default styling for that. Oops, I wrote it as CSS, my fault. There we go. So we'd have that span, and then the text that we would actually have is this.props.link text. That would get passed in. So yeah, that's what's actually going to get passed in. And then the other thing that we're going to need here is an on-click, and we're probably going to need like a this dot go to link kind of thing. The other thing we're going to need here is cursor pointer, so that, well actually that's only on hover. On mouse over equals this dot change cursor. On mouse out equals this dot default cursor. We end up writing a whole bunch of methods. No. Well, we're re-implementing an anchor. All of this stuff is built into the HTML tag because we're re-implementing. We're looking at what would be necessary to build that behavior. Because that's what React gives us the ability to do, is to build our own tags. If I just put an A tag in, but I'm not building an A tag, I'm building anchor. Right. If I just used an A tag, yes, of course, it's going to do all this. But that ruins the point of the exercise. Yeah. So, don't ruin my fun, man. So we would have pointer cursor as a method. And what's the E for? The event. Yes. E dot target dot style dot cursor equals pointer. It's not inside constructor. Nope. Constructor stops right there on line 10. Thank you for spell checking, though. And default cursor, which also gets the E dot target dot style dot cursor equals normal. So that gives us our mouse over, change the cursor behavior. And then this dot go to link. So window.location.href equals this dot props dot href. Nope. The click is an event, but so this one doesn't need the E pass to it because I don't need to get a reference back to this element. I'm not changing anything about that element. I'm changing the whole page, which is going to break my React app, but not for the purpose of this. Let's just keep going. But I have a bug right now. What is my bug? I'll give you a hint. It is on line 21. Hmm? Nope. Window.location is built into the browser. Yeah, I have to bind it. By default, goToLink is defined as using the same context as a fat arrow method. So this doesn't get rewritten, doesn't get rebound. So if I want this to work, there's two ways that I can do it. I can say this dot goToLink equals this dot goToLink dot bind this. I can do that in my constructor. The other thing I can do is that. And I can use a function expression which works. Does? Yes. So let's go back to this version. One question at a time. I'll get to that one. So what does bind do? what I am doing with .bind oh gosh, we're welcome to JavaScript land. In this case, is I am setting the context of running that function. So in JavaScript, this as a keyword is going to be set as the object which invoked a function when the function keyword is used, not in fat arrow functions. In the class semantics, the ES6 class semantics that we get, when this is compiled, this gets set using fat arrow context. So what .bind does is I'm changing the definition of that function so that when it is run using the context of the component. Otherwise, the this context does not get rebound. So that's what I'm doing, is I'm forcing the goToLink function, when it is run, to be able to see this as a component. Otherwise, it will see this as the span, which will not have a props property on it that I can access referencing the data that was passed in to the component. Yes. Well, what I'm doing is I'm saying when this method is run and the this keyword is used, it should refer to what this is in my constructor, which is the component. Basically, I'm setting goToLinks this to be the same this as constructors this. So this is that this. And then I'm able to access this.props.href, and it is the components this.props, which is what I want. And I have to do that in any custom functions that I add to my classes if I am accessing this.state, this.props, this.setState, like anything. If I'm reading from state, if I'm setting state, and I'm using a custom method that's not one of the lifecycle methods, then I'm going to have to do that. All the lifecycle methods are already bound properly because they are inherited from the component, and that's taken care of for us. But when we add custom behaviors like this, like the function that I just wrote, then I have to do the extra binding. And so the two ways I can handle it is either binding in my constructor or doing a function expression. And those work. Arguably, yes. However, it is easier to do a function expression, however, a great big asterisk. We don't have a guarantee that Babel's always going to continue to compile those the same way all the time. Right now, it's a shortcut that works, and it looks like it will work for the foreseeable future. Knock on wood. And this is metal, so I just ruined it. So, you also had another question. What was your question? Oh, why? Yes. So why did I need to bind goToLink and not, say, default cursor? It's because I'm specifically accessing properties of the component, like this.props or this.state. Whereas in the cursor methods, I don't need to access my props or my state. I just need to change the style of the target there. So that's why. Yes. Oh, if I do the function expression? Yeah. Yeah, so if I do this, pardon me, if I do this here, I don't have to do, oh, really? Oh, such a stupid editor. My apologies. So yes, if I do that as a function expression, currently I don't have to do the binding. But this will always work. Yeah. This, we'll see. No, so if you tried to bind one of the built-in lifecycle methods, it wouldn't freak out, but it's the equivalent of saying Bond, James Bond. Pointless. It's redundant. Yeah. You're just saying, I really, really want you to have the component as your scope, as your context. Really want you to have it. Like, I'm sure that internally React is like, aw. There's probably an aw method that you just don't see the console.log of. Sure. That's an that is an excellent question, and I'll give you 3 very good answers to that. Answer number 1 is when the course started, Sublime was the standard and VS Code didn't exist. Second answer I will give you is if you haven't learned by now, every senior dev is a little bit of an opinionated jerk inside. And that's a legit reason for as an answer for that question. Reason number 3 is the reason we all hate Sublime is because it's not our primary editor, so we typically don't code in it, so we're not as comfortable in it. So the muscle memory and the quirks and the little things like that, and this is a React plugin that I added to Sublime at one point, because I'm like, oh, if I ever have to code in React in class, this will be helpful. Yeah, this one clearly is not the best React template syntax thing. But so yeah, what you're experiencing is we're all opinionated jerks that have other editors that we use, but Sublime is a great editor that many people use successfully. It is considered to be a default standard. It's just not one that we're used to. And the other big reason is that, yeah, when the course started and we made the decision to support Sublime and Atom, VS Code didn't exist. If we were reevaluating that decision now, hi KB, he's not even here. Good. But yeah, if we were reevaluating that decision now, it would be VS Code, like without a doubt. VS Code's an awesome editor. If you put a gun to my head and said I'm not allowed to use Vim anymore, there would be that moment where I'd consider saying, "Tell my family I love them," but I would swap over to VS Code like in a heartbeat because it's an amazing editor. So. Yeah, this thing, it has everything you will ever need, but this falls under my general rule of tools should be a partnership, not a negotiation. For note-taking, Sublime is awesome. For doing this, it's a negotiation. So that's a little bit longer answer than you probably expected, but I'm being 100% transparent. Most of it's because I'm a jerk about editors. So. But yeah, like now we're at a point where we have a component that outside of the tooltip stuff, we'd also need to do that. Technically, we would need to do this because we're implementing, incrementing the click count because somebody has clicked on our link. And then we'd also want to probably have a method that changes the style so that it's purple now. And there's all of the other built-in behaviors of an anchor tag, but as a very naive implementation, we've just rebuilt an A tag from HTML and used React to do it. And at the grand scheme of things, it wasn't that hard. It put us in control where we now have this element that we can add to the page where we get to prescribe the behavior and the appearance of the element. Why did I not do this.state.clickCount++? Nope. Because I needed to, I need to set click count to be whatever the current state, whatever the current state is +1. Why didn't I just do this as this.state.clickCount++? What does ++ do? It increases the value by 1 and write. Do we ever write directly to state? No, we don't. Are there any benefits to using EJS over React if you know React? Okay. Max, that's a loaded question, and I'll tell you why. EJS is a back-end technology, React is a front-end technology. So the benefits to using EJS is that you get to use server-side logic to construct your DOM. You wouldn't necessarily mix EJS and React so much because the EJS at most would set up where the root div is that you're going to render your app into. You might do that on the server side and serve up that initial, to your question earlier, like relatively empty page. You might do that with EJS. And then once the page is in the browser, React would get triggered and it would render everything into that root element. That's a common use for using EJS and React. But EJS is what you would use if you were doing traditional HTTP and pages were being built and rendered on the server side, whereas React is what you would use if your backend is being used as an API and all the business logic is on the front end. Yep. Right. Ooh, that's a really good question. Okay, so for Calgary's benefit, the question that Eric just asked was, you've seen a number of different methods now, and in fact, next week you're going to see a completely different one with Rails. It's still relatively traditional HTTP, but there's differences. But you've seen traditional HTTP where you've used templates on the server side and rendered it that way, done everything with like get and post, put, patch, delete. And then you've also seen React single page apps where all the business logic's on the front end. What's the right use case for determining which one to use when? So there's a couple things that are in play here when you're making a decision like that. One is you're going to decide what the needs of the app are based on what the customer, what benefit the customer is going to get out of the product. Your tech choices are always going to be focused on typically giving the customer the best possible product. SPAs, like single page apps, have very, very fast UIs. They're very quick, they're very responsive. They like responsive as in they respond to you quickly, and they're also typically easier to make responsive. And they put a lot more effort on the front end side of things than on the back end side of things. Whereas a traditional HTTP app, if you're just doing CRUD stuff, traditional HTTP is totally fine. In fact, next week you'll see when you get to Rails that Rails is kind of one of the best ways to do traditional CRUD stuff. It's so much easier to do it in Rails than it is to build it manually in JavaScript, but just for the CRUD stuff. If it's real time, you're almost definitely going to want a single page app and use JavaScript and things like that. It's all about what the features are and what benefits you're bringing to the user. As a junior dev, you almost never have to make those decisions for a company. You might make those decisions for a side project that you're working on. You might make those decisions if you and your buddy decide to hey, we're going to build an app together. That's when you'll have to do it. And, that's why we talk about things like the project planning lecture you guys had for midterms. I'll do another one with you in a couple weeks for the final projects. That's where you start to get the visibility on really making good choices there. At the end of the day, the truth is a decent developer can build anything in anything. Okay, so why would a customer want something that's back-end rendering? Typically because it is, for example, here's actually a really great case for it. You build an app that's going to be accessed on a mobile device. It's not a mobile app, it's just like a web app, but somebody's accessing it on mobile. they're going to be out in the bush or they're out at a mine or something like that, and they may or may not have the best internet. So having all this fancy stuff going on in the front end that you have to load all that stuff onto the front end isn't the greatest. Having something where you can just send, a form post off and let the back end deal with all the mechanics and everything else and send a minimal response back, that's suddenly, a better thing.
Because you have to pull all of the data to the actual client-side device, that's going to be a lot more time intensive than actually having it all processed in the back of the same computer.
The data being all pulled to the front end for a single page app might be a very good consideration for doing it the other way. They are all security things. There are security considerations on both sides, because the more data you send to the front end, you're exposing it to the client, therefore exposing it to potential manipulation. But the more you open up paths to get to the server, the more routes there are, the more things you have to secure on that side to make sure that somebody malicious isn't going to get in. But I like that you're thinking about security at this point. If Benji had not eaten all the virtual cookies, he would get one right now. Okay, sweet. Are you going to take that from him? Okay. Yeah, I mean, these are awesome questions. And these are the ones that in some cases make or break how productive you get to be in building something out. The other thing you're going to look at is design trends. Like, everything right now is a single page app unless there's a really compelling reason not to do it. For example, you're launching a startup and your main app is a single page app, but all the stuff that you're building, like the admin side of your app, it doesn't have to look good because the customer's never going to see it. You're the only one that has to see it. So if it looks like a dog's breakfast, oh darn. So, and doing that with a traditional like HTTP app, totally fine. If you're building a sexier app for your admin than you are for your customers, your priorities are in the wrong place. So that's another case where if it doesn't, if the look and the feel of it, you just need to be able to process data, yeah, do a traditional app. When you're launched and funded by Andreessen Horowitz and can hire 26 people to take your job, let them build some beautiful, sexy admin for you at that point. But if it just needs to work, yeah, traditional HTTP always works. There's a bunch of considerations, but it should always come down to, are you benefiting the customer with that tech choice? Yeah, Ben. It kind of is. A single page app is a single page. Yeah, like Tweeter. Yeah, where that page just sits there, and then based on your interactions with it, it loads more data in, and continues to update the state of that page in the browser, and then it just communicates with the backend via API. Yeah, Facebook is 100% like that. Or can you? Are you? There's something called React Router, which still gives you routes up in the address bar. They're still bookmarkable, but it's just swapping out components in the page. You have a main app component, big invisible box.
Look at the top bar. The top doesn't change.
Yeah, the top stays and it just loads other stuff in.
So this big thing, this one.
Uh,
Yeah, that's
Correct. Correct. So there's one big main kind of home component, and then depending on what you're clicking on, it's changing which components are visible in that main home or app component, so that you can have potentially 100 different pages, but it's all just one React app, and you're just swapping out different components. Yeah, magic. It's like Facebook invented it, right? I know. The crazy part is that we got React. We've just now had React publicly for about 5 years. They'd been using it for like 2 years internally before that. Yeah. They do know a bit about what they're doing. They hired one or two smart people and paid them like a dump truck full of money. Well, for example, so this guy came out with an app with a framework called, I want to say it was like Incendio or something like that. This was about a year and a half ago, where he took the basic principle, like the API of React. In fact, his framework was it was about 85% React compatible, but he wrote a new diffing algorithm to compare the shadow DOM to the virtual DOM that was like several times faster than React's. And React, Facebook was like, hey, that's really cool. You want a job? And that framework disappeared off the internet, and all of a sudden React got faster. Yay! Yeah, and he's now making a lot of money as a front-end dev at Facebook. So, yeah, that's it's actually really cool. Like, and it's not. I'm like, yes, he's a great dev, but it's not like he'd, ascended the ranks and marble pillars and all that other stuff. He was just dev who had a really good idea about how to do something, and all of a sudden he has a job at Facebook. So, yeah, cool. So we've kind of wandered a bit, but yeah, this gets you a little bit more into the mindset of working with React. And then what we'll do this afternoon in the breakout is we'll actually build a quick little React app. And the reason for doing that is I want to show you how data can pass between components. So how I can have like several components on a page and be able to get something I do in this component to affect the data that's showing in this component over here. So I'll build something this afternoon that will demonstrate that for you. Any last questions? Calgary, let me know if you guys have anything as well. Yeah, Sebastian. Yeah. It is easy to make the plus plus mistake, yes.
Yeah, or like, is there any suggestion on how to avoid it, or any?
The only suggestion I can give you on how to avoid that makes me sound like an even bigger jerk than I did when Sylvia asked me about editors. And the answer to that question is never write your code and call it done without reading it again. And in general, write better code. Like, I wish I could give you a better answer than that, but a lot of us will write something, we'll run it, it works, we're done, we like close the editor, bye-bye, move on to the next thing. No. Once you're done, once you figured out the logic, that's when you stop, you take your hands off the keys unless you're scrolling, and you read through your code again, and you rubber duck every single line. You ask yourself, what have I done here? What have I done here? Is this the right step? Is this the right step? Oh my gosh, I've just done this like 3 times. That's so dumb. Let me do it once. Like, you start the refactoring process at that point. Part of your refactoring should be looking at things like, am I reading from state or am I writing to state? Ooh, I was writing to state there. That's bad. I know it worked. Dodge that bullet. Let me fix that before I submit it. It's part of the process you just have to have as a dev when you're working in React, because there are a number of moving parts where you just have to hold your feet to the fire, metaphorically speaking, until you're sure that what you're submitting is good code. Yeah, you might find some linters that will watch out for that kind of stuff, like, ooh, you modified state here, outside of this.set state, but not all linters are going to, mileage may vary. And, hey, opportunity for you to write a linter that will make you famous and maybe get hired by Facebook. Because I'm sure that there's people at Facebook doing this all the time and being like, oh my God. Yeah, there's a Britney Spears song there. Write that linter and you'll be famous. I get 10%. Witness, it's on camera. He said okay. Cool. Any other questions? Yeah.
So read only, that means only set, like our props generally set inside your tags.
Props are set when you're like adding that component into your app and deciding what values get passed to it. Yeah, that's when you're defining the props. But keep in mind, props inside your component might change, because if the parent app gives your component new props, that's going to trigger a re-render, and now the values of those props are different. Because like I could put this anchor in and decide that the link text needs to shift from, Google to, Ask Jeeves or something, right? And this component would then get re-rendered, and this would end up showing up as a completely different bit of text, even though it's my same code in my component. Yeah, but I wouldn't ever change that value inside the component. Okay. Yeah. Cool. Cool. I'll try and Frankenstein these notes together and send them out to you guys. Thank you.